Hello and welcome to 2021's first episode of Thinking Big with ECFR. My name is Mark Leonard. I'm the director of ECFR, and I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming you to the first episode of 2021, where we are going to look beyond the immediate crises which are facing the world at some of the big ideas that could be reshaping our geopolitics in the years to come. And I am absolutely thrilled to have AnneMarie Slaughter with us here today, who I will introduce very briefly. As you know, the goal of this series is to bring together some of the most radical and far-thinking thinkers from different parts of the world who can help us understand some of the structural changes which are going on behind the headlines, but which will change the way that we work. And I am really excited to have AnneMarie here today to launch another session. But before I go into that, I have three quick housekeeping points that I would like to make. The first is that we're going to be managing this event in two parts. The first part is going to be live streamed for 30 minutes. We're then going to have a very brief transition to move on to the second part, which is for our Zoom audience only. Please feel free to tweet about this event using the hashtag #ThinkingBigWith. And for our Zoom audience, please add your questions into the Zoom chat box or raise your hands later on during the Q&A discussion. As with the first event, we will be looking at 5 big questions, which we're asking all of our guests in this series. And then I'll have some back and forth with them before opening up for a wider debate. Our guest today needs very little introduction. She's one of America's top foreign policy thinkers. She's admired by America's new president, Joseph Biden, who's been very complimentary about her work. And I think she was one of the first people in the foreign policy community to understand how our entire world is being reshaped by networks and by different kinds of relationships, not just between heads of state and government, but at all sorts of different levels. And to really explore the hidden wiring of globalization and how that is changing the relationships between countries, what it means for the future of our economies, of our societies, of our politics, but above all, of international relations. I've known AnneMarie for a long time now. I was really inspired by her book on the New World Order, which came out in 2004. We met shortly after that, and I've learned a huge amount from her and how her thinking has developed over the years. I thought her book on the chessboard and the web was one of the really great books of international relations in the last few years. And I'm thrilled to have you here with us today, AnneMarie. Before we go into the substance and hear about your big idea, we do ask all of our guests which European, past or present, they would like to have dinner with, because we're still we're optimists here, eternal optimists. We hope that we will once again be able to have dinner with people in person. So maybe you could tell us who you would want to have dinner with once the lockdown finishes.
I'm happy to do that, although the end of the pandemic is not going to help me much. But let me just say how happy I am to be here, and particularly to be having this conversation with you, as our thinking is often intersecting in many ways. But my favorite dinner partner, I had to think a bit, but pretty clearly would be Elizabeth I of England. Without question, in terms of somebody I would love to talk to.
Great. Why?
Well, I'd ask her how she managed the boys. I would really like to know. And I'm assuming, of course, she would tell me. Elizabeth I was not noted for being frank. But assuming we could have a true heart to heart, I would want to know how she thought about Europe, how she thought about the world. But I would really want to know how she managed to be the force she was in a time that was not exactly conducive to female power.
Okay. Well, why don't we go into the substance, and we can see how with that advice from Elizabeth I, you go about reshaping the world. We saw President Biden at his inauguration yesterday promising a diplomacy first approach to the world rather than an America first approach. If you were leading this big change in American diplomacy, what would you like to see happen? What do you think a new kind of diplomacy first approach would mean in practice?
Well, the first thing I would say about his speech yesterday was that this is a president who's more traveled than any other president ever has been. He's on a first name basis with leaders around the world, and yet he devoted only 5 sentences of a 21-minute address to foreign policy. And that tells you so much, that really his foreign policy is going to be domestic renewal. He understands, as he said, the world is watching, and the world is watching to see if the United States can basically get itself together. So that's the starting point. Then he says, yes, it's diplomacy first. That means re-engaging the world. And his first executive orders, he did that very quickly. We're back in the Paris Agreement. We're back in the WHO. We've appointed somebody to Anthony Fauci to the WHO. We're back in the world. But what I think he needs to understand more than anything else is that the world has moved on. And so we have to approach the world not as a returning power, but almost as if we were a new leader. Like, where are you and what are you thinking? And how can we contribute, lead, mobilize, push, but not with a predetermined agenda?
So the big question,
sorry about the noise. There's noise outside, but I can't do anything about it.
So, AnneMarie, you've thought more than almost anyone about what kind of global politics we're going to need to deliver on those big domestic issues that we're facing, whether it's the climate emergency, whether it's rethinking how we deal with digital issues, whether it's security issues. What kind of blueprint do you see emerging for the sort of world that we're in at the moment?
We need a world that can mobilize state and non-state actors almost in equal measure. And I call non-state actors global actors because I don't like defining them by what they're not. But if you look at the key issues that are going to really matter to Americans day to day, which is what he needs to focus on, obviously the pandemic is first, but health security generally, because this will not be the last pandemic. And we need a global health infrastructure. Climate, and there Biden it really does get that all the way back to one of the early Democratic debates where the candidates were asked, what's the greatest threat to the United States? He said climate. So, but again, climate, health, certainly anything digital, given the companies, thinking about violence of various kinds. All of those problems cannot be solved by governments alone and cannot even be solved by governments first. So what he has to do, which no one has done, although the EU is actually closest, is to think about what does an order look like where you have different hubs that can mobilize governments, for sure, international organizations, but equally business, philanthropy, civil society, universities, faith groups, the whole panoply of energy and resources that is going to penetrate well below the surface of the state. And I would add to that mayors and governors.
And how would you go about doing that, given how much geopolitical competition there is at the moment, how little desire there seems to be amongst the great powers to work together?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily announce this to the world, but I would essentially start by privileging global problems over great power competition, the absolute opposite of what Trump wanted to do. But also even a very different approach than certainly Americans who were raised in the Cold War reflexively do. I mean, my generation, and I would say the generation even two behind me, are still raised on a diet of international affairs or foreign policy, means looking to other countries first. And that we know how to do. It's relatively easy. At most, you've got 20 or 30 countries to worry about, and many people would prefer only 6, and countries, and maybe the EU in there as well. So they naturally turn to focusing on countries, and then they bring in what they call transnational issues, or again, global issues, but they're never front and center. Biden needs to reverse that. He actually needs to think to himself, China's really important, Russia's really important. Yes, I want a new deal with Iran. Yes, I've got to, watch my flank with North Korea, but I am going to put global issues first. And I am going to focus less on what to do about China and less on what to do about Russia. There'll always be crises, and much more about how do I work with all of our allies and again, global actors as well, to actually create a global infrastructure that can address these problems. Because if we can't, then we're letting citizens down, but also that's what they expect from some kind of global order, and they're not getting it.
Okay, so we've got some different perspectives on the problem which you're setting out. So I'm going to just show you a couple of slides, and then maybe it'd be interesting to hear how they feed into your thinking. The first slide we have is a quote from Charlie Kupchan, who I think is a friend of yours and who we all know very well, but you've both been writing articles about the future shape of the world order. And what he seems to suggest is almost the opposite of what you're talking about. He says that Washington needs to look for a concert of major powers, a steering group inclusive of democracies and non-democracies alike, to flesh out new ideas of the road, update norms and practices, and adapt existing institutions to new global realities. So he seems to be saying that the solution is not a Cold War, but it's also not about starting with these global problems. It's starting with the realities of geopolitical competition and seeing how you can tamp them down and manage them. And then also got a couple of other things which I think I might want to bring in now just to see how they affect you, which is more to do with America, because we heard that Biden is not going to go for America first. He wants to work with others. But as you said earlier, people do seem to have moved on quite a lot over the last 4 years. And as well as the crisis of American democracy, which we've been living through, you've obviously been living through over the last few days, which has, I think, left a deep scar in terms of how people look at America's internal politics, both within the country and outside. There is also increasingly questions being raised about how much power America has, what capacity it has to shape the world, and whether people actually need to listen to America in the way that they did earlier on. We've just done a big opinion poll where we asked Europeans in lots of different countries about it. We had a very interesting event to launch it this week. But I just want to show you 2 slides which I think are quite shocking, I think, to many Americans. The first is really this question about power. And we found that most people in most countries think that China is going to overtake the US as a global power within the next decade. Up to almost 80% of people in Spain. But in every country, there are more people who think that China will be more powerful than America within a decade. And that is also leading, I think, Europeans to think in a slightly different way about how they should handle their relationships. Because a lot of people talk about Cold War 2.0 between the West and China. And the hope is that Europe will play the same role that Western Europe played in Cold War 1.0, to be very closely aligned with the US and the alliance being the sort of central pillar on which our foreign policy is based. But the second slide is quite shocking in many ways, because it shows that most people in most countries would rather not take America's side. They don't want to take China's side either. They want to stay neutral. We first found this out about a year ago when Trump was at the heart of his power, launching more and more aggressive policies towards China. And many people assumed that finding, shocking though it was about Trump and the fact that people were allergic to the way that Trump was dealing with the world. But this poll was taken after Trump's defeat in the election and shows that most people have not changed their perspective because Biden was elected. So though we found in our polling that people are very excited about Biden coming into the presidency, they don't really believe in America's power to come back as a global leader, to reshape the world. And that therefore leads to a desire to stay neutral. How do those two perspectives make you feel about your kind of core thesis that you talked about? Why is Charlie wrong? It would be the first one. And then secondly, can America actually deliver given what's been going on in the world and the way that even its closest allies look at American power now?
Yeah. Well, Charlie and I have been friends since grade school, but we disagree quite radically on this. I mean, that is exactly a view that says, let's go back not only to 1990, 1980, but sort of 1815, right, where we're going to have a concert of great powers, regardless of whether they're democracies or not. His wording is very telling, a steering group. Now, first place, I don't think the rest of the world is going to agree to be steered. It's just infinitely more complex. But second, that steering group cannot deliver on things like a global pandemic, on climate change, on migration, on digital issues. It just can't. The governments don't have the right kind of power. They've got military power, they've got economic power for sanctions, they can create groups and initiatives, but they can't actually change behavior on the ground in the way you need to change it to protect against a pandemic, or to cut emissions, or to build a new infrastructure, or to coordinate things like migration policy, not just in capitals, but across countries. So I simply don't think that structure is responsive to this very messy, very uncomfortable spaghetti bowl of networks that we have all over the world. But I think it's understandable that lots of more traditional foreign policy people would like to return to a simpler world. I think the world I'm proposing, or the world we are in, that I think many of us see and map, is just very messy and very hard to figure out how you get things done.
Before we go on to that, but maybe one of the things which I think was surprising about the Trump years is that people did assume that there was a limit to what states could do. But with an entities list, for example, you can actually have quite a big impact on how these big companies the size of countries behave. If you tell Huawei that they can't deal with, they can't, or ZTE, that they can't import semiconductors from the US, or if you tell Google that they can't carry Chinese, that they can't supply their platforms to Chinese telephone manufacturers, at the strike of a pen, you can completely reshape global markets. You can take billions or tens of billions off share prices of different companies around the world. How did you feel about what we've learned over the last couple of years? Has that caused you to rethink any of these prior beliefs that you had about what was possible and not possible?
No, and I don't want to say that governments aren't important. I mean, my view of the world is definitely both and, right? There is a chessboard world and there's a web world, and both are important. You have to learn to what I call see in stereo. But I would say those actions are very effective in the short term. In the longer term or medium term, they are what Henry Farrell and others, actually, Mark, you've written about this. That's weaponizing interdependence. That is using the connections you have, which are huge assets. But when you use them against others, countries and entities, they will then reroute. So immediately there's a big impact. Longer term, and it's quite possible now, people start trading in different currencies or putting their assets in different banks or developing other supply platforms. And indeed, what you're seeing now is a return in China and in the United States to a slightly more autarchical posture, right? Where China talks about dual circulation policies and the United States talks about self-reliance enough to be sure that we're fine in a crisis. So I don't think that long term, simply using those connections as weapons gets you to where you need to go. Again, in terms of actually delivering what a global order is supposed to deliver, which is peace, prosperity, the ability to tackle really big problems collectively. I don't think that 6 or 8 powers steering everybody else can do that. And again, I think you need to use what I call impact hubs, where you create a hub, you see how well it's doing, you measure how well it's doing, and you fund it accordingly.
I want to hear a bit more about the American power thing, but maybe I can just have one more question about why you think that people have been so reluctant to focus on these big, stubborn global problems which are coming out of the dark side of globalization, whether it's climate change or the other huge pandemics. Because, one would have thought that these are the sorts of questions which would put zero-sum petty competition between powers into perspective and get people to focus on our common survival rather than their relative performance. But instead of that happening, I think in many ways we've gone backwards over the last 20 years, certainly in terms of the way that people are thinking about things. I don't want to dismiss the importance of the Paris climate deal or other things which have been done on the coronavirus, but in the 90s, people's thinking did seem to be much more positive. Some people were more open to thinking about empowering the networks that you're talking about to really get involved in the internal sovereignty of different countries. Now, even when these problems arise, they've still got their chessboard hats on when they're dealing with them, and they're looking at their relative gains and advantages rather than being above all driven by planetary survival. Why has it been so hard to shift from one mindset to another? And in fact, why have we gone backwards?
So I just think it is so much more comfortable to live in the great power world. You need a handful of people. They're often the same people. They've known each other for a long time. They get on a plane and they go and they negotiate with one another. I'm not saying it's easy to do that. Those negotiations are hard, but it is so much easier and so much more comfortable. And frankly, it's just an elite foreign policy world. Whereas these kinds of global problems, we have to start by changing our maps. Right? It's not a map of 200 squares. It's a map of countless networks. We do now have the tools to map those networks, but the people who learn foreign policy and practice foreign policy do not do that. Interestingly, people in the Pentagon or in ministries of defense are more likely to, because they've been fighting terrorist networks and they've developed, the kind of mapping software and mapping approach. Once you've got it mapped, and that is not easy to do, then you really need to be able to think about, all right, who's connected to whom? Is that a good connection or a bad connection? What new connections do I have to make? And how do I have to disrupt it? Now, the people who've been doing that are foundations. I always use the example of the Global Alliance for Vaccines, Gavi, which the Gates Foundation started with the World Health Organization, a group of pharmaceuticals, a bunch of NGOs. They created a hub, they mapped the networks. Same deal with climate. When you look at Bloomberg's covenant of mayors for energy and climate, that's 7,000 mayors. And they're all connected, but it's messy. And it requires different training, different tools, and different strategies.
Okay, great. So maybe we can pivot to the second sort of question, which is, in a way, you're saying that it's very difficult for any power to do anything and to move forward in the messy world that you're talking about. But it seems particularly difficult for the US compared to where it was earlier, because 20 years ago, we were in a unipolar moment. There was no one questioning George Bush's ability to reshape the world. Lots of people questioned how he was going about doing it. But the idea that he could do it was not open to question. That's much less clear now. How does this perception of American weakness reshape the options available to Biden as he goes about trying to deal with the global problems that you've been discussing?
Well, I think it's going to take a while to sink in. I do not think that most of the very talented and competent people in Biden's foreign policy team have even begun to appreciate the results of your poll. And I will say, even to me, it's fairly shocking as somebody who came of age still closer to World War II and the relationships between Europe and World War II, and I'm half European, which of course strengthened it, that sense that Europe is basically with us, that the United States and Europe quibble and fight, and NATO's always in crisis, and there's always these issues, but fundamentally we're kind of on one side and China and Russia and other countries are on another, is still very strong, certainly among my generation of Americans. And again, I would say in foreign policy terms, probably Gen X and millennials as well. So I think the United States, again, needs a listening tour and needs to really absorb the damage, not just that Trump did, but as you've pointed out, the ability to cycle from Bush to Obama, to George W. Bush to Obama to Trump to who knows in 2024. That's going to take a while to sink in. I think a lot of people will think, no, we just need to kind of get Biden back, get a different face to the world, and those attitudes will shift, and maybe some of them will. Overall, I think it's healthier, at least for now, for the United States to have to reckon with that shift in power. Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, said when I was on a panel with him in October, the world has moved on. And now really he was looking at a world, particularly in climate, of the EU, India, the United States, and China as being the major powers thinking about climate. So I think it's salutary for the United States to have to come to grips with this different world. But again, I think if you asked Europeans to think about American scientists or American companies, even though there's a lot of tension with the tech companies, or American universities, even though Trump did his best to harm them, there's still a far more positive view of the people of the United States and the non-governmental parts of the United States than there is of the U.S. government. And I'd be working to strengthen that.
Okay. I got two more quick questions. One is, what is going to change in our world after COVID, and what's going to stay the same? I mean, we at the beginning of the crisis had to live in a completely different way. There were all sorts of things which seemed to come in. How many of those sort of changes do you think is going to last and is going to actually have a structural effect?
I think the biggest structural effect is that it has been a time machine to the future or an accelerator to the future when we talk about the future of work. There is a good side to that in terms of the greater flexibility of knowledge workers to be able to work from home or other places. And Mark, you're a parent, you can appreciate that. This sort of notion that we all need to march into the office and be there from 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whenever is I think that's done. At the same time, for ironically, the essential workers, the writing was on the wall in terms of automation and digitization, that the retail, high street retail was already in trouble, and it's in far greater trouble now. And we haven't even seen the impact of the many firms that use the pandemic lull to automate even further. So the biggest change, and it's really devastating in terms of employment and livelihoods for many people, has been this acceleration of the massive technological change that was already on the horizon, but got a big push. Beyond that, I think it's hard to know how much people will forget this year. From where we sit now, it seems unimaginable that we would just return to anything looking like normal. Again, part of that is how long does it take for the vaccine? I do think citizens around the world will be far more attentive to the predictions of people who've been arguing we were going to have these kinds of pandemics for 20 years. And that will make people more cautious about all sorts of things.
Okay. So final question in the first segment, which is, you're a European as well as an American, certainly by heritage, I probably not by passport, but anyway, at least emotionally and mentally. So if you were called upon to give one piece of advice to Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and Ursula von der Leyen about how to handle the world that we've just been discussing, what would that be?
Well, I am half European, but I'm 100% American. And just for the Americans listening, the first line on my Twitter handle is patriot. And I do consider myself to be a patriot. In that regard, I would, though, urge Ursula von der Leyen to continue on the line she's on. Two very important things. She's offering a new transatlantic bargain. She's really saying to the U.S., take the EU seriously, and together we can be an anchor for what I would call open society, a far better digital world, much more power on climate change, health, all these problems. That's the first thing. And the second, she is talking about this much more networked world order. Not surprisingly, the EU is an order of networks itself. What I'd urge her to do is pay much more attention to the private sector and the civic sector when she does that. The European private sector is kind of invisible when European statespeople talk about a global order. And there are far fewer foundations than the United States has, but there's plenty of money in Europe. There's plenty of civil society, and there's an active corporate sector that needs to be mobilized also on the European side, precisely to intersect with those counterparts on the American side, but also within open societies around the world. That's why I think open versus closed is more important than democratic versus non-democratic. It's what are those societies that are open enough to allow healthy, strong, positive connections among all their different actors versus societies like China or Russia or many others who can only stay in power by clamping down on that open society and thus live or die by the strength of their governments.
Great. Well, thank you very much, AnneMarie. We're now going to turn into the Zoom part of our conversation. So we're going to say goodbye to our live stream audience. Thank you very much to all of you for listening in. Stay tuned for future episodes. We will be putting links up to them on our website at www.ecfr.eu. Now, to our Zoom audience, please stay online for a few seconds while we wait for the Q&A to begin. I have a number of comments which people